K suddenly jumped off his stone stool as he rubbed his eyelids. With the lack of a leg, he swayed when standing. His big action of course drew Xiao Xuan's attention. Xiao Xuan dropped his almost completed stoneware and grinding stone, and looked at old K curiously. He was in a pretty good state of mind and felt that he had not made any mistakes. With everything in the process reaching old K's standard, why was he acting like he was in a what the FCK kind of mood? Ah Xuan, you. K finally said a complete sentence after many yous. How do you train yourself normally? Not knowing why K asked that, Xiao Xuan explained the training arrangements he had recently, in detail, of course not mentioning the special power he had. To be honest, his training recently was more like preparing for stone crafting than normal training. There were many newly awakened kids by the training ground, just like Xiao Xuan. They were either training their strength or practicing by throwing stuff. Xiao Xuan was the only one focusing on finding stone cores. Some people even secretly mocked him for doing the wrong thing. After some thinking, K did not find any abnormal points based on Xiao Xuan's description. Xiao Xuan worked very hard and he showed endless effort when he was doing the stone crafting. That was also the reason why K was willing to teach him. However, K himself was pretty hardworking when he was learning the skills. Why didn't he achieve such significant progress? Anyways, K could not figure out the reason, so he had to attribute Xiao Xuan's achievements to his talent. No wonder he awakened at the age of 10. Old K waved his hand to tell Xiao Xuan to continue after he calmed himself down. On second thought, he stopped Xiao Xuan and took out a big straw curtain and divided the stoneware workshop into 2 parts. He asked Xiao Xuan to go to the inner room to keep crafting. Although feeling curious, Xiao Xuan followed his command. Old K must be doing it for some reason. From the other side of the straw curtain, Old K could still see the small figure of Xiao Xuan, crafting and refining a piece of stone flake. Old K's eyebrows relaxed, and he couldn't help but smile as if he had thought of something. Xiao Xuan came out from his separated workshop when it was almost sunset, covered with sweat. He passed the stoneware he completed to Old K for examination. He crafted more stone flakes and stone cores than usual, so he got out later than usual. However, Old K did not examine Xiao Xuan's stoneware one by one as usual. Instead, he put them aside after a glimpse at them. Old K chose not to look more, but he told Xiao Xuan, "You should go now. Starting from tomorrow, you may carve and refine stones according to your own judgment. Do whatever you think is right." "Okay, I will." In fact, Xiao Xuan wanted to make something of his own a long time ago. However, he was not that skilled, so the thing that he created was totally different than what he had in mind, and sometimes he failed during the process. Now since Old K had said so, Xiao Xuan wanted to do it again properly. In order to make a satisfying stoneware, he needed to go through the process of carving stone flakes, refining, pressuring, heating and so on. Also a lot of tools were required, such as a hammer, press roller, plunger, grinding stone, chopping stone and other fixing materials. The tools in Xiao Xuan's cabin were not enough, so Xiao Xuan needed to come to Old K's place every day if he wanted to craft something. However, at the very beginning, Xiao Xuan did not dare to dream so wildly, so he decided to start with the normally used stoneware in the tribe. The next day, Xiao Xuan took the stone cores he had selected that morning to Old K's place and began to craft. Xiao Xuan intended to craft a double-winged stone arrowhead by himself, one of the most frequently used stone arrowheads. Leng Ga alone had a large consumption of them. Old K had taught Xiao Xuan about the techniques to make a stone arrowhead, and said the other skills could only be gained during the process of practicing. Of course Old K pointed out some details that were worth paying attention to. For the next few days, Old K did not watch Xiao Xuan closely from his side as Xiao Xuan did the crafting. After all, Xiao Xuan could do just as well without his supervision. Leaning on a wooden cane, Old K took out a wooden box filled with all kinds of stoneware in different sizes and put them out in front of his house. They were the stoneware made by Xiao Xuan over the past few days. Most of them were spearheads and arrowheads and had a style a little different from Old K's. In fact, Old K had changed his rules lately. During the afternoon he no longer allowed people to come inside his house. In the mornings he would come out with some completed stoneware. One needed to do the trading fast if he wanted some of his stoneware, because Old K would collect his things and go inside the room at noon, and not come out in the afternoon. So when seeing that Old K took things out at that hour, people gathered. "Hey, Old K, why are you doing business at this time now?" "Hi, Old K, these things are not Xuan's handcraft, right?" Many people knew that Xiao Xuan was learning stone crafting from Old K, but people were not optimistic about it. Some would discuss in private how long Xiao Xuan could manage to keep learning, and whether he would be like Old K's former apprentices that left, or got kicked out by Old K forcefully. However, unexpectedly, Xiaoxuan was still learning, and it seemed that old K was not frustrated or mad as well. Wasn't that strange? Actually, the one who guessed the stoneware was made by Xiaoxuan laughed at himself after he finished his sentence. People coming with him also laughed over it, and none of them took it seriously. After all, in their perspective, Xiaoxuan had only been learning for a few days, and it was impossible for him to craft such successful stoneware. They were just messing with old K. This is a nice stone arrowhead, and it could be used for setting up ground bows. Hey, the barbs are wonderfully polished. I like that. One squatted down and began to select his favorite items. Seeing that someone had begun choosing, the other stopped messing around and hurriedly began to choose their own favorite items, as if fearing that all the good stuff would be bought by others. After all, the stoneware from Old Key's place was much better than the others. Hey, Old K, have you changed your style? The barbs on your arrowheads used to be shorter. A warrior said as he touched the wings of a stone arrowhead. K just sat there with his poker face as usual, in silence. The warriors that came to do the trading were already used to Old Key's character and did not expect Old K to explain. After all, it was normal that a stoneware crafter changed his style. When hunting, warriors had a large consumption of stoneware because unlike metals which could be recycled, the stoneware could only be used once. This resulted in a rather high scrap rate, which led to warriors preparing a lot of stoneware before every hunting mission. Almost 20 days had passed since the other hunting team left. Normally speaking, hunting teams would return home in 20 days. Even when they met some hardships or other difficulties, the hunting period would not be more than 30 days. Their families were still in the tribe after all, and they would starve if the warriors did not return. So if someone did some calculations, one would know that the hunting team was about to return. Meaning the other hunting team was preparing to leave. Once the hunting team returned, the other one would set off for hunting after handing over their daily duties. The earlier they prepared their stoneware, the better. They will return in a couple of days. In the morning I saw that wounded people were sent back. This time 2 warriors were badly injured, but not fatally. I heard that no one got killed this time. Someone said as he chose the items. So we are about to set off. I have to go back home and take a few more things to trade with Old K. You said that 2 were injured. Who were they? People began to discuss, but their selection speed did not slow down. Once they had chosen an item, they would grasp it tightly in their hand, and the others would regret not grasping it sooner. You do the trading or not, hold your tongue, and get lost if you're done with trading. Old K waved his arm with an icy face. They'd better do the discussion elsewhere. Ashwin was still in the room, crafting. They might disturb him. In the eyes of the crowd, Old K was a tough guy and he was not easy to deal with. It seemed that he cared about nothing but stoneware. He was also quite aggressive when yelling. However, in fact, Old K valued Xiaoxuan more than anyone else in his heart. He became unhappy when people started making noise and he began to drive them away. People were not angry. They stopped talking and hurriedly continued their picking. When the majority of the stoneware was picked out by others, and seeing that no more people were coming, Old K collected the remaining small stoneware into the wooded box. He shook his head as he talked to himself. Why are the small stoneware unappreciated? When used properly, they can be more lethal than the big ones. When Xiaoxuan had finished today's work, he headed back home with his exhausted body when at the very same time, the hunting team on mission returned. In the midst of cheers, the hunting team returned on that path of glory, and their bodies left long shadows because of the sunset. Strong warriors carried game much bigger than themselves, and they looked like ants carrying quail eggs. Some of them would not only carry the game on their shoulders, they would sling the game over their backs, or drag them with straw ropes. It was a big harvest, and the warriors were quite loaded. It was said that during this mission no one got killed, but 2 warriors were badly injured. The injured were at the shaman's place and they were already stable. Because of their tough warrior's body, they would be totally energetic again after some time's rest. Xiaoxuan was more than tired because of a whole afternoon striking and crafting. He turned back and headed towards his own cabin after he had spotted Lang Ga and Mai in the crowd. He did not rush forward to cheer for them, like the others. He was exhausted already. In the front part of the team, an obvious shorter person carried 2 giant boars. That was Mao and he was very pleased with himself. He paid extra attention on people's praise and his mouth could not be kept closed because of the smile. It felt so good. He straightened his back more and looked at the crowd as he turned his head. Just then, Xiaoxuan's back leaving with Caesar entered his sight. Xiaoxuan was not spirited because of tiredness, and judging from his back, it looked like he was pretty upset. Mao thought that Xiaoxuan must have been humiliated by him carrying 2 giant boars. Also, Mao thought about how to crush his dignity again when Xiao Xuan joined the hunting mission. After a night's rest, Xiao Xuan felt that he was full of strength again, full of vigor. The sourness of his muscles also disappeared, as if he had not done so much striking yesterday. After he had spent the whole morning collecting stone cores, Xiao Xuan as usual planned to go to Old Kei's place in the afternoon. However, Old Kei told Xiao Xuan to take a break for today, so that he could get sufficient rest. Looking at the works he had completed these days, Xiao Xuan decided to go out as he picked out some items. The stone tools that Old Kei took out for trading were only half of Xiao Xuan's production. The other half, Old Kei asked Xiao Xuan to keep for himself. So now Xiao Xuan still had a lot of stoneware for himself. He filled the selected stoneware into 2 mesh bags made from straw rope, and began to walk to the mountainside district. By the time Xiao Xuan arrived, Leng Ga was still sleeping. Every time when he was not on duty, Leng Ga would sleep for 3 or 4 days when he came back from a hunting mission. "What's up?" Leng Ga yawned, and his eyes were almost closed. "Oh, I'm here to give you something. You should go back to sleep." Xiao Xuan dropped one of the mesh bags on the stone table in the room, and prepared to leave. He wanted to hear the stories during this time's hunting mission at first, but based on the current circumstances, he should wait for a few more days for stories. "For me." Leng Ga was curious about what Xiao Xuan had brought, even though he was sleepy. Leng Ga opened the bag, and when he saw the completed stone arrowheads inside, his nearly closed eyes opened wide immediately. Traces of sparkles flashed in his eyes, and he took out one stone arrowhead and observed it closely. The 2 edges on that stone arrowhead were especially made according to Leng Ga's usual needs. So the size and shape were slightly different than normal ones, and the barbs were longer, because Leng Ga was used to this type of stone arrowheads already. If changed at his will, perhaps Leng Ga would not find them useful. So Xiao Xuan did not add his own ideas on them. Leng Ga stared at the stone arrowhead he had at hand, and the more he looked at it, the more surprised he became. The arrowheads in front of him were well polished, and the important thing was that the 2 edges were completely perfect. The 2 edges could balance the arrowhead, especially when it's flying, so that it might hit the target at a more precise angle. When the wings were wrongly processed, it would affect the whole hunting mission. In order to increase the lethality of the arrowhead, Leng Ga would craft his own arrowheads, with longer and sharper edges, and 2 sharp barbs. Leng Ga had always felt that only his own hand-made arrowheads would be useful for him. And he disliked others' work, even when the arrowheads were from his grandfather. However, seeing the arrowhead at hand, Leng Ga was more than shocked. Because he could tell by weighing it at hand, that these arrowheads were perfect for him to use. The arrowheads he had at hand now looked exactly the same as the ones that Leng Ga crafted himself. No, in fact they were not exactly the same. These arrowheads in front of him were more close to perfection. Normally when Leng Ga crafted arrowheads himself, he would not bother polishing the details, for he had a large consumption of them. However, the ones in front of him were much more refined. "Hey, thank you, Xuan. I like them very much. By the way, please thank Old Kei for making such nice arrowheads for me." In the eyes of Leng Ga, of course the stone arrowheads were made by Old Kei, and naturally Xiao Xuan asked them from Old Kei give them to him. Leng Ga used his thumb to touch the edge of the stone arrowhead. Ah, the blade was so sharp, no wonder it came from the master. Xiao Xuan was about to walk out, but he turned around and smiled at Leng Ga's words. "I'll pass your words, but by the way, those arrowheads were all crafted by me. You should try and see if they are useful." At Xiao Xuan's response, Leng Ga froze as he was touching the stone arrowhead. He looked up at Xiao Xuan, astonished as the muscle on his face quivered hard twice. "Wait a moment." Leng Ga took a few steps and came in front of Xiao Xuan. He practically asked the question word by word, as he grasped the arrowhead with his hand. "This is your work?" Xiao Xuan nodded, "Yes." "Not too bad, huh?" "Not too bad." Leng Ga stared at Xiao Xuan with red eyes and heavy breath. If those were judged as not too bad, then how should his own hand-made arrowheads be judged as stone waste? Xiao Xuan did not quite understand what Leng Ga meant by doing that. He had gotten some stone arrowheads from Leng Ga. Since the arrowheads had already been used once, Leng Ga did not intend to take them to hunting missions in the future. However, it would be such a waste to throw them away, so he gave them to Xiao Xuan for his training. Back then, Leng Ga and the others were all using second-handed stoneware to practice, which was quite normal in the tribe. Xiao Xuan made those stone arrowheads based on those that Leng Ga gave him. There were more or less defects in the stone arrowheads, but generally speaking it wouldn't affect the usage much. Xiao Xuan had always thought that those defects were caused by usage, and Old Kei also did not comment on those when he saw them. But for the arrowheads crafted by Xiao Xuan, Old Kei appraised them as barely not too bad. That was also the reason why Xiao Xuan said not too bad. Lang Ga stared at Xiao Xuan with a rather complicated look. Perhaps it was because that he had a grandfather who was a stoneware crafter. He thought he was talented in stone crafting. He made stone tools himself, and now he had some achievements in that field. Even though his skills were not as good as his grandfather's, he was confident that after perhaps 10 years, he would be better than him. What's more, among his peer he had more skill in crafting than most people. Especially when it came to stone arrowheads, almost no one could make better arrowheads than him. However, now there's a newly awakened kid who was only 10 years old and had only been learning stone crafting for less than 30 days. The stone arrowheads made by him were slightly better than his works. Based on his eye of quality, he could naturally tell that this stoneware could not be made just given enough time and efforts. Let alone the fact that the stone arrowheads were quite smooth at their surface, and as there was no point of stagnation, highly likely, these arrowheads were processed quickly and smoothly. Why was there so much difference since he came back from the hunting mission? I was only out for 20 days, not 2 years. Lang Ga's face turned red as he thought of giving a bunch of second-handed stone arrowheads with many flaws to Xiao Xuan before the hunting mission. He wanted to hide under the ground. Even though he was thick-skinned usually, he had totally different standards when it came to stoneware. Perhaps he was affected by his grandfather. Take a deep breath. Then another deep breath. Lang Ga put out 3 trembling fingers and pointed at the outside. You, do not show your face in front of me for the next 3 days. As he finished his sentence, Lang Ga dropped the curtain and he could not sleep anymore. He stepped towards the small room that he used for stone crafting, and began to work. While from the other house near Lang Ga's room, walked out an old man with gray hair. He looked hale and hearty even though he was old at age. It seemed that he could still easily carry a stone that weighed 100 kilos. That was just Lang Ga's grandfather. The old man just woke up from his nap and now he intended to go down the mountain to some friends as he chewed some meat jerky in his mouth. He thought perhaps one of his sons was crafting stones in preparation for the next hunting mission when he heard the sound of grinding stones. However, with a single look through the window, he found out that it was his grandson, who was supposed to be sleeping in his own room. Now he was working in the stoneware crafting workshop. The old man nearly choked by the meat jerky because of shock. His eyes were wide open like stone balls, and he stared at Lang Ga in the same manner as staring at a ferocious beast in the forest that existed once in a century. What the FCK? That little bastard used to sleep for 3 to 4 days after every hunting mission, and even beating him up could not drag him out of his bed. What happened? While on the other hand, Xiao Xuan was quite confused when he was told not to show his face for the next 3 days. What was wrong with Lang Ga? Hypotension because of sleepiness. Xiao Xuan shook his head as he took the other bag and continued to climb up the mountain, because Mai lived higher in the mountain. Being a mid-level totemic warrior, Mai occupied an important position in the hunting team, so he had a lot to deal with when he came back to the tribe. Of course, he would not be as idle as Lang Ga. When Xiao Xuan arrived, he was just assigning patrol missions to some warriors. Xiao Xuan waited and he came inside only after the other 2 warriors had left. Inside the room, Mai was cutting the meat. During the hunting mission, warriors would just pre-treat the meat, so after they came back, they needed to cut the meat into smaller pieces and preserve some of them. Also, they had to sort out different kinds of meat for later use. Hello there. Mai waved his hand seeing Xiao Xuan entering the room as he tossed a piece of meat covered in blood, the size of a watermelon, to Xiao Xuan. Here you go. Take it back with you later, for you get hungry easily after you become a totemic warrior. Training is exhausting. Many people would deduct their training time when there was a lack of food. After all, totemic warriors would consume a lot of energy when they trained themselves. Naturally, they would eat more. Especially for those newly awakened warriors like Xiao Xuan, they were in the process of building up their bodies, so food became even more of an essential object. Thank you, Uncle Mai. Xiao Xuan took the meat and handed over the mesh bag to him. This is for you. Mai dropped the stone axe in his hand and looked at the mesh bag curiously. Did you make them yourself? Yep. They can't of course be compared with your own tools, but I guess they could still be useful anyway. Xiao Xuan scratched his head. Unlike the stoneware he sent Lang Ga, he picked less stone arrowheads, but instead he added more spearheads into the mesh bag. Spearheads were used for throwing. Because the 2 people had different positions in the hunting team, the stone tools they tended to use were different. Mai had already heard about Xiao Xuan learning stone crafting with K from Lang Ga, however, it had been such a short time, so Mai did not expect anything fine from him. Xiao Xuan was already thoughtful for bringing things here, and he would never trash the kid's confidence and enthusiasm. Mai smiled as he opened up the mesh bag. He planned to say something to encouraging him. Actually, you can never rush yourself in the process of stone crafting. At your age and with such short times learning, you are already pretty good for making these, and in the future. His words stopped as Mai took a look at the fine crafted spearheads in the mesh bag. He literally swallowed the next part of his words back into his stomach. The well-crafted spearheads were just the same as those he often used. They had deeper ridges and the blades on the two wing edges were extremely sharp. The two wings stretched and joined one another on the sharp peak, which was very smooth without any trace of carving. Obviously the stone crafter paid extra attention while polishing them. Unlike most spearheads for other warriors, Mai liked the kind of spearheads with deep bloodthirsty ridges in the both sides, and Xiaoshuan had noticed that, so he added them on his spearheads too. Just like Lenga, Mai had given Xiaoshuan some used stone tools for training as well. Most of his used tools were stone spearheads, but he had never thought about receiving such nice gifts in return when he offered Xiaoshuan those used spearheads. Are these from your own stone crafting? Mai stared at Xiaoshuan until he saw him nod. Then Mai looked back at the spearheads he had at hand. Indeed, he had not expected Xiaoshuan to possess such amazing talent. Under the current circumstances, even if Xiaoshuan could not improve his ability, he could live a peaceful life without starvation in the tribe, depending on his skills. After a while's hesitation, Mai laughed out, good. Excellent. Unlike Lenga, Mai had not bothered to pay so much attention on stone crafting after all, so he cared not that much for competition. In front of Xiaoshuan's handworks, he had pure admiration. After properly storing those spearheads, Mai asked about Xiaoshuan's training lately and offered some advices. He was confident about Xiaoshuan, but still he agreed with the idea that newly awakened warriors should get as much trainings as possible, and they should not think about joining hunting missions in a hurry. Or else, they would be just like the lad named Ah Fei, who only turned out to be a burden of the hunting team when it came to real hunting. He was too eager to succeed, but full of flaws when the time came. Mai thought for a bit and reached out his palm as he said to Xiaoshuan, punch my hand, and let me see how much strength you've got. An obvious occurrence for totemic warriors when they got any improvement was that they would obtain more strength. That was why Mai asked Xiaoshuan to do that. He wanted to see his progress during this period's training by that. However, Mai did not expect Xiaoshuan to have much progress, for he was learning stone crafting these days after all. Okay. Xiaoshuan placed the meat at a corner and moved his limbs a little. In fact, he himself also did not know how he was different from other kids that awakened at the same time with him, aside from the special ability he got. Also he was unaware of which stage had he reached. Gaining Mai's advice and judgment would be very beneficial to Xiaoshuan's training in the future. Since it was a test for strength, he had to use the totemic power inside him. After a deep breath, Xiaoshuan urged the totemic power inside him and on his cheeks there were clear totemic patterns revealed immediately, and soon the totemic pattern spread from his face to the nape. Seeing that Xiaoshuan stimulated the totemic power so quickly and naturally, Mai was quite satisfied. Xiaoshuan was already much better than some who took a lifetime to be able to stimulate their totemic powers like him. Suddenly, Xiaoshuan stepped on the ground with his right foot, while he rushed at Mai with a fast speed. He punched hard on Mai's palm. Bang! It was a fist against a palm, but it was like two mountains crashing against each other. Xiaoshuan felt like he punched a piece of steel, and it felt totally different from his daily training when he punched at the mountain rock. Xiaoshuan's body shook a little, and he stepped back as he withdrew his fist and rubbed his hand with the mouth open. In fact, it was not just the hand, he felt that his whole arm was hurting. As expected, there was a huge gap between some newly awakened kid and a mid-level totemic warrior. Looking at Mai, his palm did not even turn red as if he was just hit by a piece of tofu. Xiaoshuan also noticed that Mai had flashing totemic patterns on his body, which stretched over his elbows. They even got to his forearms. However, Xiaoshuan's own totemic patterns had only extended over his shoulders. However, Mai was not as calm as he acted out. He was looking at Xiaoshuan in surprise. Compared with the hurt at his palm, the totemic patterns on Xiaoshuan's body was the thing that shocked him most. However, the totemic patterns had gone, and Mai was not sure whether he was imagining it, but the strength of that punch was larger than most newly awakened kids. It was not wintertime, and the temperature grew higher every day. Since he had to train himself every day, Xiaoshuan wore a sleeveless animal skin top in order to be more convenient. Naturally his totemic patterns were out in the open, even though they just extended over his shoulders. Perhaps Mai was not so observant as old K, but compared with most people, he could exceed them easily. Again. Now use all your strength. Mai commanded. Seeing that perhaps Mai had some other thoughts, Xiaoshuan did not hesitate to follow his order. Taking a deep breath, Xiao Xuan stimulated the totemic power in his body again, the totem in his mind lit up, and the flame covering those two horns rose up, which meant that he had fully aroused his totemic power. Feeling enormous strength running through every piece of his muscles and every bone, Xiao Xuan's mind also reached the peak. After such a long time doing stone crafting, Xiao Xuan's precise control of totemic power showed its advantage. He became very familiar with the feeling of gathering up all his strength, for he could feel that every day during the process of stone crafting. Every time when that happened, he would feel extremely self-confidence. In the meantime, the totemic patterns on Xiao Xuan's body became totally clear. One could feel the burning heat of the flame. At the very moment that Xiao Xuan took a step, the earth trembled slightly. Whoosh! Before the punch arrived, the wind pressure of the punch was already there. Although Xiao Xuan was just a primary warrior who had not been awakened for long and his strength training was not good enough, Xiao Xuan's punch carried unmatchable momentum at the bursting moment. Seeing the kid in front of him, who was only as tall as his waist, Mai's eyes opened more. Bang! Clear sound of cracks rose. Xiao Xuan immediately felt the sharp sting all over his whole arm. It was like he got roasted on a bonfire and constant burning pain that seemed to be impossible to be stopped. However, Mai's face froze for some time, but soon he recovered from his astonishment. Inside his heart he was still shocked, as he stared at Xiao Xuan, while he forgot to take back his palm from the air. The rebound made Xiao Xuan step back a few steps and he had to shake his arm as he created hissing sound out of subconscious. He did not expect it to hurt so much, and it felt totally different from the last punch. Ah Xuan. Mai said. His voice sounded somehow difficult and bitter. Yes. Xiao Xuan looked at Mai as he continued to shake his arm. He did not worry about breaking his bones, for even if that did happen, he would be fully recovered after a few days' rest. That was the advantage of the physique of the tribe's people. When you go back, you should prepare. At Mai's words, Xiao Xuan wondered if Mai would say the same thing that Leng Ga told him, such as to not show his face for 3 days or something like that. He stared at Mai for him to finish his sentence. Prepare to join the hunting mission next time. Xiao Xuan looked at Mai in surprise, for he did not expect him to say something like that. Wasn't he supposed to attend the 3rd hunting mission? Why did Mai change his mind? Unless it was because of the earlier punch. Okay. Xiao Xuan answered. Of course, Xiao Xuan would be very glad to join the next hunting mission. Scenery in the forest changed every day, so one would get to see different sights if he entered the forest in different times. For example, there were some flowers that only bloomed once a year, and some plants would only have fruits and seeds once in a year. So one could see more and experience more when going out earlier. Or one had to wait another whole year to see the same situation. Leng Ga and Ji both had told him in the past that many plants in the forest were quite dangerous, so warriors needed to be able to spot and avoid them while hunting. However, one could only know them after seeing them once, or based on other people's descriptions, one could never get the whole image. Also, since Mai allowed Xiao Xuan to tag along during the next hunting mission, obviously he acknowledged his ability. So Xiao Xuan needed to only prepare for the hunting. At that time, some other person came to look for Mai, that was Tuo. Xiao Xuan had met him before and knew that they must have something to discuss. Xiao Xuan decided to leave and excused himself. Since you are busy Uncle Mai, I will leave now. Thank you again, Uncle Mai. After Xiao Xuan had left, Mai made a few movements with his stiff palm. He shook his shoulder and slapped his arm, some cracking sounds resounded. Because of Xiao Xuan's punch earlier, a few bones in his arm had been dislocated. And that shake pushed the bones back to where they were supposed to be. Although his palm looked fine, Mai knew himself that his palm was injured. In the end, he had underestimated the boy. In fact, Mai had planned to encourage Xiao Xuan and persuade him to train more before he could go for a hunting mission. He also intended to share some examples of hunting with him, and take him to the 3rd hunting mission. However, after experiencing the strength of Xiao Xuan's punch, Mai changed his mind. What did the boy mean with going back to prepare? Asked Tuo. To prepare to tag along with the next hunting mission. Answered Mai. Tuo showed some dissatisfaction. Wasn't he the one saying that the more preparation, the better? I thought he would be patient enough to wait until the 3rd hunting mission. Did he come to beg you? For the sake of the shaman, Tuo was kind toward Xiao Xuan. However, when it came to hunting, Tuo did not want to make the slightest compromise, for the 1st hunting mission that just ended was a good example. Several mistakes almost cost the lives of himself and other warriors. Mai shook his head. He did not bring up the subject, but I proposed it. Why? Tuo was even more confused. My smile on the face grew bigger and bigger, since the blade is already almost finished. Sharpening it even more is just a waste of time, for it could not be much more sharper anyway. A talent should not be buried in the tribe, he needs to go outside and challenge himself in the forest. As Xiaoshuan left Mai's place, he took big strides going down the mountain. His every step was quite big, and it seemed that he only tipped on the stones and basically just flew down the path. After going down the mountain, Xiaoshuan did not return to his cabin immediately, for he did not worry about Caesar. He knew that Caesar was helping the kids in Orphan Cave to dig out stone worms. As he was about to call out Key's name in front of old Key's house, he saw the straw curtain get lifted fiercely, and an old man with gray hair marched out. Judging from the old man's expression, he seemed angry, for his beard almost flew up and reached his eyes. Seeing Xiaoshuan standing at the front door, the old man glimpsed at him from his head to his toe, frowned, as if thinking about something. His look was like a stone knife, trying to peel his body as if he was a stone core in the eyes of the old man. His beard waved a little, suggesting that he wanted to say something. However, in the end, the old man left without saying anything, except for a loud humph. Xiaoshuan was curious about his reaction. Was he mentally disturbed? Seeing Ji pop his head out and look around, Xiaoshuan asked, "Who was that?" After confirming that the old man had left, Ji chuckled, "That is Lang Ga's grandfather." That was Lang Ga's grandpa. Indeed, he was exactly like Lang Gaz described him, a grumpy old fellow. Entering the room, Xiaoshuan shared the news that Mai allowed him to tag along during the next hunting mission. Ji's jaw almost fell on the ground at the news, he was totally stunned, while old K answered with a single calmly, as if he had already expected that. Without any more comment, he asked Xiaoshuan to come inside and craft the hunting tools. The stone tools for hunting need to be in much higher quality than those for training purposes, and crafting those stone tools took longer time. Xiaoshuan already had plenty stone tools for training, but he only had a few for actual hunting purposes. Half of his handiwork was traded out by old K, and he gave those specially made tools to Lang Ga and Mai as gifts. So what was left for his own use was quite limited in quantity. Xiaoshuan also did not explain more, and he went inside after taking off his animal skin clothes. Ji looked at the straw curtain hanging there as a separator and snickered. He knew that old K was treating Xiaoshuan pretty seriously and he was hiding him from the others. It was true that during this period of time, old K allowed no one to come inside the house. However, there were people like Ji, who would try to enter by using the window. Of course there were also others that couldn't be stopped by old K, and Lang Ga's grandpa was just one of them. Old K was trying to keep Xiaoshuan hidden from the others so he didn't get stolen away by some other stone crafters. "Hey, old K. Do you know why they allowed Xiaoshuan to join the hunting mission in advance?" asked Ji. Old K remained silent. "Humph, you can keep your little secret all to yourself anyway." Ji walked inside and carefully lifted the straw curtain a bit. He quietly stared at Xiaoshuan inside, trying to see what was different now that made the old-fashioned stubborn Mai change his style. After a while observing, Ji walked back with one hand cupping his jaw with mouth wide open. He was totally stunned, as if he had seen a carnivorous animal suddenly become a herbivore. Before Ji had the chance to describe what he saw, he noticed that old K was polishing a tooth-white saber. All his words were swallowed back into his stomach, and after some time, Ji pointed at the saber being polished and jabbered, You. There were a lot of marks on the saber's body, and plenty of dense small gaps were spread out over the blade. Seen from afar, they looked like serrations, but in fact, these marks were caused by constant use. The original hilt was broken long time ago, so old K tore it down and the handle part now was exposed with an extending part of the saber, the base the original hilt was installed on. Ji's sight was fixed on that saber and it took him a really long time to come back to his senses. He had guessed what old K was about to do, which surprised him. That was even more shocking to him than seeing Xiaoshuan's totemic patterns. When Xiaoshuan came out of the room as he had finished today's stone cores, old K was installing the hilt to that well-polished saber. The thing he used for the hilt was a special kind of resin. After it had been mixed and heated up, it was then shaped into the shape of a hilt and covered the extending part of the saber, until it cooled down and then became a new hilt. Xiaoshuan also normally uses the same process, as those kinds of hilts felt much better than wooden ones or those made from straw ropes. "Wait a second, take this saber with you after I finish with the hilt," old K said to Xiaoshuan, who was just about to leave. Xiaoshuan looked up at that saber. It was relatively wide, and the blade was nearly half a meter long. The back of the saber was as thick as a thumb, which was much thicker than most of Xiaoshuan's work. Judging from Ji's expression, Xiaoshuan knew that the saber was something significant. He had not yet touched the saber, so he couldn't say anything certain, but as he stared at the saber, he sensed that a heavy icy feeling was permeating in the air, as if it was trying to push people down to the ground. That is. Xiaoxuan was confused. That is a saber made from the tooth of a ground Komodo. Ji glared at the saber with all the reluctance in the world. He wanted to grab it into his own arms. Ever since Old K had his leg broken, no one had ever seen that saber. In the past, he had begged Old K for 1,000 times, but Old K still refused to take it out and let him have a look. However, now Old K was giving the saber that represented his glorious days to Xiaoxuan. Ji envied Xiaoxuan in his heart, but he knew his own situation and he knew that he could only admire it and lose all other thoughts. Ground Komodo. It was a ground Komodo. Although Xiaoxuan had never seen one in real life, Xiaoxuan had heard from Lang Ga and the others that a ground Komodo was a giant beast living under the ground. When facing a ground Komodo during a hunting mission, no warrior should think about tossing any stone spearhead at him, and the only thing one could do was to run for their lives. No one wanted to challenge a ground Komodo, because a human could never win. After listening to so many hunting stories from Lang Ga, Xiaoxuan had never heard which hunting team had encountered a ground Komodo. After Old K passed the saber to Xiaoxuan and pushed him out the door, Ji was still staring at Xiaoxuan's back, but his sight was fixed on the saber. The saber did not look showy, but it was pretty heavy, at least 100 kilograms. Xiaoxuan held the tooth saber in front of his chest, and his mind was totally blank for a long time as he stood outside the house. Xiaoxuan placed Old Key's saber onto the newly made stone table in his room, while Caesar bared his teeth as he glared at the saber, standing at least 2 meters away from it. Ever since he sniffed the saber earlier, Caesar became extremely cautious and his eyes showed that he was extremely alert, for he kept his distance from the saber all the time and never came near. Xiaoxuan reached out his hand to touch the saber's body, which was not the same cold feeling as normal stone knives. It had been decades, and the intense ferocious aura of the saber finally settled down. After thousands of times polishing, the knife became smaller in size because of the abrasion. The blade was full of small dents once, but it became smooth and sharp again after Old K re-polished it. Xiaoxuan sighed slightly and he used a leather bag to carefully cover the saber. He did not expect Old K to give him such a precious saber, without caring about that he might lose it. After placing it aside, Xiaoxuan took out a piece of stone plate. The stone that it was made from was not of good quality, and Xiaoxuan was merely using it as a writing board. He had been keeping record on how many stone tools he needed to craft and how many had already been completed. Aside from spearheads and arrowheads, Xiaoxuan planned to make a few stone balls to take to the hunting, which could be used for flying chains to trip the beasts. For the next 3 days, Xiaoxuan had been stone crafting in Old Key's place and he was there listening to Old Key's hunting stories. Old K did not brag about his glorious days, and Xiaoxuan did not ask further. He assumed that Old K would tell his legends when he wanted to. After they were finished with the work, Old K asked Xiaoxuan, "Do you know why people in the mountainside district rarely go fishing?" That was something that Xiaoxuan also wondered about. Since people noticed that fishing was easy, why would so many people be so willing to risk their lives for hunting? To be honest, pulling out fish was quite simple, so one would not go through much trouble as long as they mastered the tactics in it. Besides, as far as Xiaoxuan knew, not every person in Mountainside District had sufficient food. However, in actuality, Xiaoxuan had only seen a few old men who had trouble walking around come down the mountain and join the army of fishers. None of the kids living up there went fishing, let alone those warriors, except for those guards by the riverside. Basically, no one would try to snatch the fish from people in the Mountain Foot District. Old K raised up his hand and stared afar through the window. From that direction, the mountains afar could be seen. Because of the tradition, said Old K, 900 years ago, the chief and the shaman left an admonition together that all warriors must go for hunting as long as they are not disabled. Even when the food is sufficient, no one shall indulge himself in a leisurely life. One can never slack off and should try every possible way to better himself. It was never easy for totemic warriors to improve their strength. When they were hunting outside, they needed to be engaged in thousands of life and death struggles to improve themselves from first-level warriors to mid-level warriors. However, it would be extremely difficult if they wanted more progress. For warriors like mine needed to be prepared to lose their lives every time they went hunting outside. Among the whole mountain, people living in the Mountain Foot District were the weakest in ability, which also meant that they were relatively the slack group of the tribe. But even so, every time when hunting, Xiaoxuan had not seen a single face of reluctance. Everyone was so positive, even when they already had enough fish to support their living. Many warriors living up in the mountain would never allow their kids to come down the mountain for fishing. Perhaps they did not want their kids to have the concept of obtaining food is easy. From the admonition that passed down through generations, all they needed to know was that they had to take risks to obtain food. To earn food and clothes, one had to put himself into danger and fight against those fierce animals in the forest. Pressure was the only motivation of improvement. Those warriors who had not been tested by hunting are no true warriors. Old K summarized. It sounded cruel, but quite understandable. Xiao Xuan thought of the fresco he saw on the wall back in the cave and the last sentence, "One day, we shall return to our previous land. Glory is still in the fire, and the fire of the scorching horn will never be put out." After leaving Old Key's place and coming back to his own cabin, Xiao Xuan counted the stone tools he made today and sorted them out while placing them at the same place where he stored the other stone tools. The arrowheads that Xiao Xuan crafted for himself were not the same as those he made for Lang Ga. These arrowheads had more streamlined bodies and the wings appeared more like flat strips. Aside from those, Xiao Xuan crafted a few three-winged arrowheads. Unlike the stone tools for training purposes, Xiao Xuan had carved his name on every piece of stone tool that he planned to take with him on the hunting trip, which was a custom of all hunting warriors in the tribe. After sorting out the stone tools, Xiao Xuan noticed that Caesar was yawning as he squatted there with his ears droopy. He was not spirited at all, and at first sight one would see him as a lazy dog lying in front of his own door. No wonder that Lang Ga and the others would just ignore him these days, instead of seeing him the same way as they saw game. Animals like Caesar were not challenging enough, and they certainly had no interest towards a wolf who had lost his wild nature. However, how should he deal with Caesar while he's gone hunting? It would be over 20 days. Leaving him home was not an option, and Xiao Xuan would not feel comfortable if there was no one to look after him. Send him up and ask for the shaman's favor. No, that old wizard could barely look after himself when he got busy. Xiao Xuan even considered whether he should send Caesar back to the orphan cave, but after some serious thought, he gave up on that idea, for Caesar would be totally undisciplined if he stayed in the cave, and no kid there could control his behavior. He thought of several people who might be able to take care of Caesar, but finally, Xiao Xuan decided to ask Old K to be his guardian. Also, Caesar would be obedient at Old K's place. Since Xiao Xuan had been learning from Old K for such a long time, Caesar became quite familiar with the place. What's more, Xiao Xuan believed that Old K would be good to Caesar. So, 3 days after the previous hunting team came back, the other team prepared to set off. Carrying Old Key's saber and the stone tools he crafted for himself, Xiao Xuan took a detour to Old Key's house, for he planned to leave Caesar there. Aside from Caesar, Xiao Xuan left plenty of fish and meat. Caesar was growing fast, and he ate more every day. Now be good and stay with Old K. I'll pick you up once I return. Xiao Xuan could still hear Caesar's whine as he carried his equipment and climbed up the mountain. He sounded pretty pitiable, he was more like a dog. According to the earlier agreement with Lang Ga, Xiao Xuan should stop by at his place first, and then Lang Ga would be the one to take Xiao Xuan to the mountain top. Before the hunting team set off, there was a gathering. Xiao Xuan was unfamiliar with many rules and procedures, so he had to be guided by someone, or else he could easily make mistakes. By the time Xiao Xuan arrived, Lang Ga was already waiting at the door, with quite a few big animal skin bags full of tools and equipment. Let's go. Lang Ga carried the bags and walked in the front. Many people saw Xiao Xuan as he climbed the mountain with Lang Ga. People were pretty surprised to see him, for no one expected that Xiao Xuan could tag along with the hunting team this time. Is Fei not with us? Xiao Xuan asked Lang Ga. Xiao Xuan had seen Fei's figure, but he noticed that Fei did not carry any equipment, nor was he heading up the mountain. In fact, he glanced at Xiao Xuan angrily. Oh, him. Lang Ga whispered, in the last hunting mission, that lad disobeyed some order and caused a scene. So Mai and the others forbade him to join this mission, but left him at home for reflection. If his reflection was satisfying, then perhaps he could join the third mission. But anyway, he can't go this time. So, you must remember to follow the orders when you are in the hunting team, Xuan. Understood. Xiao Xuan answered. They met Aang and a few other warriors that were Lang Ga's friends, so they all went up to the mountaintop together. The gathering was held the same place as last time's ritual ceremony, however, this time the fire pit was not lit entirely. The shaman dressed in a gray cloak stood beside the fire pit with a stick in his hand, talking with Chief Ao. When Xiao Xuan looked at him, the shaman looked his way as well. After seeing Xiao Xuan in the crowd, the shaman obviously got stunned a little. Apparently he remembered Xiao Xuan this time, and did not expect Xiao Xuan to participate in this hunting mission as well. Although confused, the shaman did not come and ask, but continued his work as usual. The scene was not as spectacular as the ritual ceremony, which was attended by thousands of people. For every hunting mission, there were only about 200 warriors. Warriors that got wounded from last mission would remain at home for recovering, and there were some others who needed to welcome a new birth at home or needed to look after others. So they wouldn't be joining the hunting. Warriors in unstable conditions or had other assignments were also excluded from the hunting team. So even the same team would send out different warriors for different hunting missions. Leng Ga and the others stood on their old spots naturally, and Xiao Xuan stood right next to them. In the front of the team stood the important people. There were about 10 warriors and Mai was one of them. The shaman stood beside the fire pit, with a stone bowl in his hand. Inside the bowl there was some dark green pigment extracted out of some plants. Warriors stepped forward one by one to let the shaman draw patterns on their faces with that pigment in the bowl. The patterns were similar as their totemic patterns. As the shaman was drawing, he whispered something in his mouth. Xiao Xuan could not hear him clearly, or even if he heard him clearly, he could not understand what it meant. Not everyone in the hunting team could be painted on the face by the shaman. The only group qualified enough to be painted were the important people standing in the front. Now their facial expressions were serious and respectful, as if they were in the middle of some holy ceremony. As for Leng Ga and the others, there was pure admiration in their eyes. Perhaps deep down in their hearts, they were dreaming about someday to stand in the front of the team and obtain the shaman's blessing before the hunting team set off. Even though Xiao Xuan had his own opinions, his facial expression was just like everyone else in the crowd, which was serious enough but mixed with some admiration. After all 10 warriors had been painted and stood back to where they were before, the atmosphere immediately loosened up. Led by the chief, people began to sing the song of hunting. It's such a shame that Xiao Xuan did not know how to sing that. In the past, Xiao Xuan had heard the song of hunting a few times, but he never managed to learn it. He had no idea that warriors were required to sing the song before the hunting team set off. SHT, it's like not knowing how to sing national anthem in the middle of a flag-raising ceremony. So embarrassing to speak it out. FCK. However, the problem was that within the tribe, normally parents and other elder relatives would tell their kids how to sing the song of hunting. Xiao Xuan came from the orphan cave, and he was in fact not this previous Xuan in the inside, he had never paid attention to that song. Leng Ga and the others did not expect to teach him about that as well, so all ignored it. However, since Xiao Xuan was not a real kid, he knew how to pretend even though he did now know how to sing the song. Xiao Xuan remained calm and he stood there with his mouth opening and closing constantly in silence. If not paid extra attention, he could be identified as an offbeat person in the crowd. Our ancestors existed since the beginning of heaven and earth. We relied on hunting when our tribe rose. Spring is warm, with all ice and snow gone with the wind. Fowls and beasts dance, while birds and animals sing and warriors cheerfully go hunting. Originally Xiao Xuan assumed that the song of hunting would come to an end after a few verses. However, as time went by, he discovered that the song was rather long, as if it was telling a story. Also, the verses describe circumstances from spring to summer, and then from summer to autumn, while it finally ended in winter. It was not only a long story, it was a FC King sad story. As if all warriors were preparing to die chivalrously. He wondered which talent in the tribe wrote that kind of a song. Even though the song described a lot of things that happened in hunting missions and warned people to be cautious, especially during winter time, Xiao Xuan found it hardly inspiring. However, almost all warriors at the scene became really excited with their necks turning red as if they got high on marijuana. Xiao Xuan could not understand these people's mentality anyway, and perhaps that was just the difference between insiders and an outsider. As Xiao Xuan was singing silently in the crowd with his mouth opening and closing, the shaman looked at his direction quite a few times. Xiao Xuan sensed his sight already, but still, he kept his eyes fixed to the front and learned from Leng Ga and the others. He got excited when others were excited. Also, when others took spears and roared at the sky, Xiao Xuan copied and did the same. Leng Ga had mentioned before that Xiao Xuan should do the same as he did, and then he wouldn't make any mistakes. The shaman's old face twitched when he observed Xiao Xuan from the fire pit. Of course he noticed that Xiao Xuan did not know how to sing the song of hunting. However, he had never expected him to be so shameless. He acted as if he were a real expert at the song. Other kids would already have been really scared if they were in Xiao Xuan's situation. After a whole song of hunting, Xiao Xuan felt that he had digested all the food he had in the morning. Since the pep rally worked, the chief did not say any more, but asked the main leader of this hunting mission to lead the team and set off. There were timings on hunting missions, or there would be many troubles if they missed the timing. Xiao Xuan lifted his legs and walked forwards after Leng Ga. He sensed a sight fixed on him, and it was just the lad Mao as Xiao Xuan looked that way. Mao was in a big surprise, for he did not expect that there would still be some newly awakened warrior tagging along in the hunting mission, given that Fei had an accident during last hunting mission. The truth was, because of that accident, even those good-behaved newly awakened warriors weren't allowed to join this mission. Obviously, Mao did not consider himself as one of the newly awakened warriors. Xiao Xuan looked away after a glimpse at Mao. To avoid making mistakes, he had to follow up with Leng Ga, and how could he spare extra energy to stare at some wimpy kid? As the hunting team went down the mountain from the top, there were a lot of people gathering on both sides of the Path of Glory. In this hunting team, there were only 2 newly awakened warriors, who were just Mao and Xiao Xuan, so these 2 were extremely outstanding among all warriors. Many people living up in the mountain were not familiar with Xiao Xuan. So after they saw Xiao Xuan in the team, they only realized that he was the one that got awakened in advance from that ritual ceremony when others told them. This was yet another occasion for Xiao Xuan to be seen in public. So he impressed even those who did not remember Xiao Xuan last time. Marching with the hunting team meant that he had the ability. All people respected those with strong abilities. With the team going down, there were more and more familiar faces. People were waving their fists toward Xiao Xuan, not as threatening him, but as a kind of encouragement. To Xiao Xuan's surprise, children from the cave also gathered by the Path of Glory. They joined in the group to see them off, with admirations in their eyes, and their little fists in the air. Xiao Xuan was a little touched, for they showed gratitude, so he didn't help them in vain. Also, Xiao Xuan recognized Sai in the crowd. However, Sai was brought here by his father against his own will. Sai planned to sleep more in the early morning but got dragged to the Path of Glory by his old man. He was watching the hunting warriors reluctantly, but the eyes of him suddenly became wide open and his yawn stopped in the middle. He spotted Xiao Xuan in the team, and then he looked at his old man stiffly. As expected, Sei's father narrowed his eyes as he saw Xiao Xuan in the team. Of course he planned on strengthening Sei's training, and thinking how to train him harder when they got back. When the hunting team got to the end of the Path of Glory, it speeded up, until the noise faded away and people behind could not be heard. Xiao Xuan carried all his equipment on his back and followed Leng Ga closely. Here was still the region that tribal warriors would patrol around. Ahead, there was a small flat ground. They would be finally outside of the tribe's territory once they passed the flat ground. Running on the thick grass, Xiao Xuan took the time to look up at the forest on the other side of the flat ground. Fog rose up like steam, and then stopped in the middle of the air. It looked depressingly heavy since the fog covered a large area of the forest. A sharp and rigid mountain top revealed its face above the fog and cloud as a black eye looking down at everything. Before he even went into the forest, Xiao Xuan felt a heavy pressure, as if being buried alive. In fact, before they went into the forest, there was a small break, when leaders assigned their tasks to warriors. Xiao Xuan took the chance to ask Leng Ga a question, who was sorting his ground boughs. So what should I do later? Leng Ga smiled. You don't bother thinking, all you have to do is to keep up with the team. After resting a while, the main leader entered the forest, together with 40 warriors, while the remaining people waited outside. The other warriors were divided into 5 smaller groups. Instead of entering the forest together, they would enter their own hunting areas according to the originally planned routes. As Xiao Xuan was listening to Leng Ga's words, he looked up and saw that Mao was leading Mao in their direction. That kid was not in our group. Why is he here now? Wants to change a route. Aang whispered to some of his pals in a low voice. Just a minute ago I saw Mao went to the leader, and right after that, Mao was called upon. Kui, who was pretty close with Leng Ga and Aang, explained. Kui was not much older than Xiao Xuan, however, he grew fast after his awakening, so now he was almost the same height as Leng Ga. Leng Ga and Aang curled their mouths at the same time. Xiao Xuan knew it in his heart, that the leader of the hunting team was Mao's old man. He learned it from Leng Ga and his friends' talks. Mao had considerable ability of his own, which was one of the reasons that he could have the chance to tag along with the hunting team. He was indeed much better than most of his peers, and he behaved quite well during the previous hunting mission. The other reason that he could be part of the hunting team was because of his father. With these 2 factors combined, other warriors in the hunting team surely had no problem with Mao's presence in the team. Apparently it was Mao's own idea to come to their group, and the leader had approved that. Ah Xuan, come here and see. You and Mao awakened at the same time, and you are similar in ages. However, Mao has more hunting experience than you, so you guys should communicate more with each other when it's time to hunting. Said Mai. Sure. Xiao Xuan did not show any reluctant expression, for he had no reason nor qualification to do that. To Xiao Xuan's surprise, Mao did not reveal the I am the world's king kind of attitude that he used to reveal, nor did he look at Xiao Xuan provocatively. Instead, he was quite obedient and he paid extra attention when Mai was arranging the plans of their mission. Judging from that, he was indeed much smarter than Faye. After a while, there were sounds of a wood whistle from deep in forest. The whistle sounded like a bird or deer's wail, so it didn't feel out of place from the forest. That was the signal sent from the advance party, meaning that there were no wild beasts ahead that were beyond the warrior's ability, and there was nothing unusual from before. So the follow-up team could advance. The advance party would send signals of safety or danger after some preliminary scouting, but they would not wait for the follow-up groups to hunt together. Since they were considered the best, their hunting area was not the same as the other groups. Tuo and Kiki, that Xiaoxuan knew, were both in the advance party. Okay, now it's time for us to enter. Mai called on the others in the group. As usual, we have to arrive at the other side of the mountain before sunset. Xiaoxuan looked at the mountain that Mai pointed out, which was a big, tall mountain. If Xiaoxuan were in his last life, it would be totally impossible for him to even think about that. However, here, he had already gotten used to it. The other groups had other hunting routes, and some of them would take detours in other directions, instead of climbing a mountain. The 30-warrior team entered the deep forest, while each and every one of them carried a lot of equipment. However, as they were traveling between the trees, not much sound was created. Above, there were numerous ancient trees, whose stretching branches and wide leaves almost covered the sky. Beneath those trees there were many unidentified shrubs clustering together. Between the spaces of the shrubs, there were roots of giant ancient trees exposing themselves above the ground. Warriors all jumped on the trunk from the ground, and then energetically leapt among the branches. About 30 people jumping over one by one, while the branches merely shook slightly. The sound of leaves in the forest did not attract any creature's special attention. Xiaoxuan followed the man ahead of him and jumped from the ground to the trunk. And a short time later he jumped on a huge vine from the branch where he stood at. The giant vine was a few meters wide as it wound around the ancient tree. There was a layer of moss covering its surface. Moist air made the moss as smooth as velvet, and one could easily slip and fall down when stepping on the moss. However, if one could keep his balance, it was a nice slide. Sliding on the vine and moving fast, Xiaoxuan could feel the fresh scent filling in his nose. That was the scent of the plants, with flowers' fragrance mixed in. Aside from that, with the high temperature, moist air lifted up all the smells of the creatures living in the forest. That was the breath of an untainted forest, full of life, danger and thrill. Smelling the air, people's body hair seemed to tremble with excitement. A millstone-sized oblate insect was lying on the vine ahead, with 3 rows of pattern-like eyes. As the insect crawled, the 3 rows of eyes blinked as it was scanning around the surroundings with its eyes. The hunting group did not slow down because of the obstacle ahead. Without any irregular sound, Xiaoxuan saw that insect be pushed away from the vine and thrown down. Whoosh! A big bird flew below the vine so promptly that it could barely be seen. And the falling insect was picked up by the flying bird. With the marching of the hunting group, the light was sometimes dim and sometimes bright. The vine arched high and then fell into the jungle again. Above, coiled around a bulky branch, there was a bucket-width wide serpent, with colorful patterns on its body. However, that was nothing special in this forest. Perhaps the serpent was full already, as it seemed lazy. As the hunting warriors were sliding down the branch on the vine, it looked down at them as it stuck its 2-pronged snake tongue out, staring at the people passing by without emotion. Xiaoxuan felt the icy sight of the snake ahead, but kept following up with Lang Ga. Since the people ahead did not mind that snake above, of course he did not need to pay extra attention. Quay experience, Xiaoxuan was merely a greenhorn. He still had to learn when to strike and when not, so he just followed. Now Xiaoxuan was in the middle part of the group, and there were other warriors behind him. The warriors after him originally figured that since it was Xiaoxuan's first hunting mission, perhaps he wouldn't adjust himself to it so easily. So they could lend a hand if Xiaoxuan could not keep up the rhythm or slip by mistake. However, unexpectedly, Xiaoxuan could follow the group closely, without making a single mistake. Along the path, Xiaoxuan had seen a lot of game. Some of them were giant bears, also some things that he could not name, while some of them were small beasts running among the bushes. However, the hunting group did not slow down or even look at those animals, but kept marching towards the mountain that Mai pointed at earlier. As they got closer to the mountain, the species of the plants changed. There were less ancient trees and the hunting group did not go through the trees anymore. Seeing that Lang Ga and the others ahead slowed down, Xiaoxuan slowed down accordingly. Mai gestured towards the warriors behind him, so 7 or 8 warriors immediately spread out in the near surroundings to see if there were any dangerous fierce animals around. After the safety was confirmed, Mai told the hunting group to take a short rest. the lined-up group changed its formation and became more relaxed. But no one was just standing, and all were preparing and sorting their equipment. Pretty tired, huh? When Leng Gao was sorting his ground boughs, he turned his head to ask Xiaoxuan if he was tired. When tired, one should drink and eat some food as a supplement for the physical strength consumption. Leng Gao planned to tell him that he should not put so much pressure on himself, for after all, they had marched from the edge of the forest to deep down its center, and one would need to stay focused to avoid making mistakes. With tense nerves, one could easily get exhausted both mentally and physically. For some newly awakened warriors, it was indeed a real task. Even Mao, who was publicly acknowledged as the best among his peer, was now a little short of breath. However, Leng Gao's carrying words got stuck in his throat when he saw Xiaoxuan. That lad acted as if nothing happened. Not only was he not short of breath, he had the energy to pay attention to that tree civet on that tree. It was Xiaoxuan's first time seeing this little beast, which was called a tree civet. It was not much larger than an adult's palm, and among its gray fur there were some brown lines mixed in. On its round hairy head, there were two big black eyes, and it seemed particularly innocent when it stared at people with those eyes. The ears on both sides were slightly droopy. It squatted on a branch which was at least 10 meters high, with his arms around the trunk and eyes fixed down on the people below. "Don't look at it. That little thing is not good to eat," Leng Gao whispered to Xiaoxuan. As they were taking the short break, talking was not forbidden, but all people talked in a low voice. Generally speaking, people in the tribe were not picky about a food's flavor, and they would swallow down those unsavory foods as long as they could provide energy. When evaluated as not good to eat, probably that thing was not only unsavory, but was probably also harmful to one's body. "Aren't they afraid of people?" Xiaoxuan asked. Many beasts would not feel afraid when they first see people. Instead, they would be more curious. However, if you show any trace of killing intent, it would be totally different. Leng Gao said, as he lifted his ground bow with the arrow pointed at the tree civet on the tree. 1 minute earlier the tree civet seemed harmless and innocent, but now it kept its mouth wide open, and looked rather ferocious, with a mouthful of sharp teeth. Leng Gao did not shoot towards the tree civet, but lowered his weapon and ignored it. "Little meat and not good to eat. Its sound is also creepy." Leng Gao looked away after saying that, and continued to work on his ground bows to see if there's any damage. When Leng Gao had left, the tree civet restored its normal appearance. A finger-length flying worm flew near it, with his wings flattering. On its surface there was a layer of thin scales, which reflected the sunlight. It was so sparkly and it flew really fast in the air. 1 second it was at one spot and the next second it was at another spot, as if it could move to another place instantly. Whoosh! The tree civet waved its arm and reached out his paw in the air, like it knew the place where the flying worm was headed. Within the blink of an eye, the flying worm was caught in the tree civet's paw. Xiaoxuan noticed that the tree civet twisted a bit on the flying worm's wings to break them, and then held the worm in its paw as if it was a breadstick. One bite after another, the worm went into the tree civet's belly, and the tree civet stared down at Xiaoxuan as it ate. When there was only a tail of the flying worm left, the tree civet stopped biting. After taking a look at the remaining tail in its paw, the tree civet looked down at Xiaoxuan and then quickly threw the tail towards him. Feeling the flying worm's remains flying towards his face, Xiaoxuan dodged and the worm remains missed him by half a step. "Jia, Jia, Jia." The tree civet began to haul. Xiaoxuan thought that perhaps his dodging earlier made the tree civet angry, while he saw that not far away, Aang acted slightly. Then Xiaoxuan looked at the tree civet's direction, but only to find that it had already left, as if it was avoiding something. Aang rushed towards the direction that the tree civet fled, and he climbed onto a tree nimbly. On his back there were 5 short spears which were only half the length of normal spears, to be used as javelins. The others in the hunting group all quieted down, and they even lowered their breaths. If not having seen with his own eyes, Xiaoxuan would never have expected that there were so many people staying here. Aang seemed to see something and he silently pulled out a short spear quickly and prepared to throw it out. However, the moment before he was going to throw, he stopped and showed a gesture to the others. Mai thought about it and waved to call Aang back. Aang climbed down the tree with regret on his face. At the meantime, all the others in the hunting group began to find convex stones and tree roots to hide themselves. Naturally Xiaoxuan did the same. In the time of 2 breaths, Xiaoxuan saw something fox-like jump out from the bushes. It ran towards a direction after sniffing around for a second. Leng Gao told Xiaoxuan to keep on waiting. After a while, Xiaoxuan heard some scratching noises. It was some creature walking and rubbing the leaves and branches. A 7-meter-high creature slowly came into their sights. It had brown fur, thick limbs, and an extremely strong tail. It looked ferocious, but judging from its slowness and heavy body, it seemed a little lazy and foolish. After sniffing with his nose, it went beside some trees and stood up on its hind legs, while its strong tail pushed against the ground and formed a triangle with the legs. As it stood up, its forelegs showed the sharp claws with giant hook-like sickles. Its claws quickly hooked over the branches ahead and cut the branches with leaves, like he was harvesting wheat. That was a leaf-eating animal, but judging from Mai's reaction, Xiaoxuan knew that it was not easy to be dealt with. Recalling the hunting stories that he had heard before, Xiaoxuan figured that the big animal ahead should be the giant claw beast. Although this giant claw beast appeared to be big enough in Xiaoxuan's eyes, in fact, this was merely a juvenile one, for adult giant claw beasts should be bigger in size. Also, it only looked lazy and heavy on the outside. When faced with danger or threat, they could be really quick to react, and its giant claws could easily uproot a tree. In fact, giant claw beasts were also in the hunting list of the hunting group. However, Mai did not command the warriors to attack it. Those trees were not tall enough, and as soon as it finished eating all those fresh leaves, and as the remaining ones didn't arouse his interest, it left walking on his four limbs, still behaving like a lazy animal. When it had left, Mai led the others to continue to climb up the mountain. As they were marching to the top, Leng Ga examined a few traps underway that he set up in the past. Inside them there were some pitiful animals. Since they did not fall in the traps long time ago, they were still alive and were executed by warriors in the hunting group in the blink of an eye. These were no large traps, so the animals they caught were relatively small in size. Leng Ga shared his experience with Xiaoxuan while he was adjusting those traps. Pointing at the warriors dealing with the prey, Leng Ga explained, after you catch something, you have to examine it first to see if it's ill. For example, that animal we caught earlier had uncolored eyes and bald spots in his fur. If you cut it open, you would smell a funny smell from its meat. Even if the prey lived, it wouldn't be alive for long. Any warrior would share its fate if he ate its meat. On the other side, the warriors in charge of handling the prey had already promptly skinned those animals and ripped out all their guts. The animals were sliced into meat straps and were put in bags, on which some grass essence was smeared to cover the smell. Mai guided the group and he focused on leading them to climb over the mountain. So along the way, they did not hunt for large-sized animals. The climate on the mountaintop was not as mild as the climate down below. Snow glistened in the sun, while one could clearly see the large basin on the other side of the mountain. Finally, before sunset, the hunting team arrived at the other side of the mountain and they reached a cave in the mountainside, which was in fact a stronghold of the hunting team. Their hunting group would spend the night inside. It was naturally easier since they had a shelter for the night. After a day's intense journey, warriors relaxed their nerves since they could finally get some rest. A bear used to live in this cave. Our hunting team put it to rest forever and took the place for our own use. Leng Ga explained the cave's origin to Xiaoxuan. Oh, by the way, Leng Ga, how did Ah Fei make a mistake during the last hunting mission? A minute ago, Leng Ga was proudly bragging about his hunting deeds, now he sighed with his smile gone and disappeared. He approached Xiaoxuan and complained in a low voice, "Hey, you'd better be the judge." Ah Fei could have messed with everything in the forest, but finally he chose to mess around with the thorn black wind. Black wind did not refer to some kind of a beast, but a general term that the tribe's people used to call those prey who preferred to hunt at night. So normally they would call them something black wind, while thorn black wind was just one kind of them. After sunset, the temperature began to drop and warriors used a giant stone to block the entrance of the cave. However, chilly wine still poured in from the edges. Inside the cave there was a bonfire, and with so many people huddled together, it was not so cold. If he looked at the sky outside, Xiaoxuan knew he could see 2 crescent moons in the sky. Leng Ga and the others said that tomorrow's weather would be fine. While outside the cave, in the silent forest during the night hours, nocturnal animals began to wake up in that basin, which seemed to be peaceful when seen from the outside. In a middle-sized lake located in the mountain foot area, there were waves on the surface of the water. A giant body quietly emerged from the water and crawled towards the bank. Those nocturnal animals who were drinking water silently fled away for safety. Instead of chasing after those little preys, the giant beast stood still by the pool and waited patiently for the water to drip down its fur and for the wind to dry its body. It only began to move until the moonlight no longer reflected off its dry body, and its giant figure soon disappeared in the dark. Like and subscribe.